Hi everyone. On today's More Than Words episode, we'll have Richard Zimler, the historical novelist and best selling author. Thank you so much for accepting my invitation. It's a pleasure.
Glad to be here, really glad.
Thank you. So, today we're having this conversation in English so we can get to a broader audience, so everyone can know about your work and your staying in Portugal for 30 years. So, how's it been this last year for you?
Well, pretty much like it's been for everybody else, I think, a mixture of trying to stay calm and not panic, and trying to find out more and more information about COVID-19 and what I can do to protect myself and other people, and trying to make my house as comfortable and quiet as possible. I have a novel called The Warsaw Anagrams, in which one of the characters says that his definition of paradise is a place where the most quiet people win all the arguments.
I
And that's
remember
what I
that
tried
passage.
to make my house into, the like quiet place where only people who are going to be nice to me can come in.
Yeah, and I've heard that you spent a lot of your quarantine or lockdown cooking and crocheting. Is that true?
That's true. I found that the confinement changed my work schedule because I used to work for 25 years or more. I used to do my best work in the morning when I was most alert, I think, and I would start right after breakfast and go to lunchtime. And I discovered that during the worst parts of confinement, when we had high levels of infections in Portugal and everywhere else, I needed the morning to be really calm. So I would watch TV and listen to music and read and, garden a little bit if I was
Mhm.
anywhere near a garden, and, um, and only start working after lunchtime. I found I needed a real long time just to be by myself and not have any stress.
That's good. So it changed a bit, but not too much. Anyway, you like to work at home, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I have a big advantage over most people, I think, because my whole life is confinement. I'm isolated. I've since 19, I don't know, 94, about 93, I've been writing books. And so I spend 4, 6, 8, 10 hours a day alone in the parallel universe I'm creating in my novel, whether that's Lisbon in 1506 or the Warsaw Ghetto in the 1940s or the Holy Land 2,000 years ago. That's where I am. That's my home. And
Although
so
you're never sorry to interrupt, but you're never really alone.
no, that's exactly right.
Even
I'm
yeah.
I'm with my characters and I'm in my setting, and that's my place where I need to be. And so I think I have a huge advantage because I'm used to spending entire weeks where I see no one except my husband and maybe a few shopkeepers where I buy food and supplies. Other people I know were used to going to meetings and being out with their kids and having a big social life and dating and going to bars and clubs, and that's
Yeah.
just not me. So for once, I had an advantage over everybody else.
You already had a quiet life, so the change wasn't that big. And I found really curious that you can crochet. Where did you learn how to crochet?
My mom taught me how to crochet. I must have been like 8 or 10 years old,
Oh,
and I liked it. And so I started making scarves, and then I stopped for many years.
yeah.
When we're in our 20s and 30s, we're so active and busy, and we're ambitious, and we're trying to, in my case, become a writer and publish novels and work with publishers and agents and bookstores, and there's no time for little
Mhm.
things. And then I guess about 10 years ago, I rediscovered crochet, and I learned that there's a lot of stitches I didn't know about. So I bought books, and now there's tutorials on YouTube for people like me. And so I, I,
Exactly.
I guess I made, I mean, it's crazy, it's insane, but when TV doesn't keep me occupied. So I need something for my hands. It relaxes
Yeah.
me.
And
And
it keeps you
so
busy. Yeah.
I'm busy. I think I've probably made about 60 or 70 scarves over the last 6 or 7 years, which is a bit insane. I give some away and I keep most of them.
That's really nice. The first time I crocheted, I was like 5 years old. My
Oh
mom
yeah.
also taught me, and that old school thing of keeping your first loop in a photo album with the lock
Yeah,
of hair, and all the
great.
pictures were from where we were babies. Yeah, that's really nice that you can crochet.
Well,
And
we have an amazing tradition of very talented, mostly elderly women these days who make the most amazing bedspreads and
true.
all sorts of home furnishing items with the most detailed, smallest, wonderful crochet. They're extremely talented people.
Yeah, exactly. So now moving a little bit to your work, you have books that were translated in 23 languages and have been bestsellers in 13 countries. So I know that when you were a kid, you read a lot of comics, but then you found
Mhm,
mythology. Was
mhm.
that the how you got into liking this all history thing and writing about historical novels and historical characters, the ones that no one else talks about? Was that the way you started?
Yeah, it was in a way. I'm not a very religious person, but I adore mythology. So Greek mythology is what I started with, and then I moved on to Norse, Nordic mythology, and that had to do with comic books too, because in comic books it's superheroes, and in mythology it's gods
Yeah.
and said demigods with amazing power. So, and then I studied comparative religion at university, at Duke University, so I learned a bit about the old stories of Hinduism and Zoroastrianism and Buddhism and Sufism, and I love that. And it mixes with history. You're quite right, because it's virtually impossible to study mythology of, let's say, the Hindus without knowing a bit about Indian history. When was it settled? When did agriculture start? Where did these
Exactly.
gods come
Mhm.
from? When did Buddhism begin in India, and where did it spread to? And so, yes, I love history. I love mythology, and for me, that's my happy place, so to speak.
Yeah, that's nice to know. It's very interesting from starting with comics and then going to mythology and
Hmm.
suddenly being writing these complicated books because you have to study a lot, right, to write your books.
Hmm. Yeah, I think I got lucky because, again, my background is in comparative religion. So when I write, I have a novel called Guardian of the Dawn, which is set in Goa, the Portuguese colony in India in
Yes,
the 17th century. And I already had the background for a lot of that book because I'd studied, Indian history and Hinduism. And so for me, talking about the Hindu gods, whether it's Ganesha or any of the others, is not unusual for me. It seems perfectly normal. Or when they make an offering of flowers in front of a statue of Devi or Brahma or Vishnu or any of their uh, representations. For me, that's perfectly normal. So
mm,
I think I have a big advantage when it comes to writing about some other cultures and distant times in history. I have the Gospel according to Lazarus is set in the
hmm,
Holy Land 2,000 years ago. Well, I'd already read the Old Testament and the New Testament, and so I begin my research with already a good solid background, which I
hmm.
do think makes a big difference.
Yeah, sure. You were talking about the Gospel according to Lazarus, which is your latest publishing in abroad in English, right?
Right.
But in here in Portugal, the latest was on Holy Ghosts in Submis.
That's right.
Yeah,
Yeah, but
because
that book, that's a very curious story because I originally published that book in the English speaking world in 1996.
I know I was going to ask about that. Why did you have to wait 24 years to publish it?
Well, it's a book that breaks some taboos here in Portugal. Those of us who know the country well and who've been here for more than just a few years understand that Portugal has made a huge evolution socially, politically, spiritually over the last 30 and 40 years. This used to be a religious dictatorship for centuries when we had the Inquisition, and then a fascist dictatorship under Salazar until the 1970s with the revolution.
Exactly. Hmm.
And so when I wrote that book on Holy Ghosts, it's about a young musician, a classical guitarist in Porto, who becomes seropositive, HIV positive, and who has a terrible relationship with his father, who would prefer that his son not be homosexual. And so I was breaking all these taboos: homosexuality, HIV, AIDS, a father who forbids his son to live the life he wants to have, And my
Mhm.
publisher, Maria de Piedad, said, you could deal with a real bad backlash. The critics could crucify you. The book could sell no copies, and worse than that, I had to apply for a visa every year to remain in
Mhm.
Portugal,
Okay.
because I wasn't born here. I wasn't a citizen then. And if the ministry refused to renew my visa, I'd have to leave Portugal, and my husband Alex would have to leave, and we'd both have to abandon our projects. Me, my novels and teaching. Alex was started a huge institute for biomedical research, and we'd both have to leave. Well, obviously, I couldn't risk that, so I censored the book. And now it's
Okay.
2021. People here understand a bit more about a pandemic, understand more about what AIDS meant to those of us living in the 1980s and 1990s. And so I thought, okay, Portugal has evolved. Now is a good time to see if they like the book.
Okay. Yes, because it has come a long way, really, in these last years. And you, of all people, should know the difference because you've been living here for 30 years now.
Right.
So, apart from the side that we always have blinds and curtains closed all the time, what are the main differences did you find when you got from America to Portugal in 1990, right?
Well, the most difficult part for me was making friends, because if you've been to America or Brazil, Brazil is very
Mhm.
similar to the United States. We're very informal, and America has lots of problems. I don't want to say that things are perfect there. Obviously, they're not. They're terrible, and they were terrible under Trump. And we have a very violent society and a crazy 75 million people who voted for Trump. But we have an informal society where people make friendships more easily. So foreigners often have the experience of going to a restaurant or a museum in New York or San Francisco or LA or Milwaukee, and they meet an American couple, and after 5 minutes of talking, they're invited to their house for dinner or for lunch or for a barbecue. And that's normal for us in America. Well, that's completely abnormal for Portugal. When I got here in 1990, people didn't want to talk about their personal lives. They were happy to talk about art and a little bit about politics and philosophy and football and music, but they would never
Mhm.
tell me what was going on in their heart. And they
Yeah.
never wanted to hear about my difficulties. And I was having a lot of difficulties because I'd moved
Yeah.
to a foreign country. One of my older brothers had just died of AIDS. My mother was alone. I had a new job, and I needed to talk about myself, but they didn't want to hear
Yes.
about it. And so I have this limitation where I can't make a close friend without being able to talk about what's going on in my life and without the other person reciprocating. And so it took me many years to to make good friends here. And now I do have good friends, but it was not easy.
Yeah, after that, you spent a long time trying to adapt, of course, and you learned our language. You speak beautifully Portuguese.
Thank you.
You have many friends for sure, and that perspective has changed a little, right? So during
Oh
these
yeah,
30 years, it changed a lot.
I think your generation and even younger people, um, they're very different in the way they approach almost everything, but friendships in particular, and gay and lesbian issues and politics. And so I think for the younger generation of Portuguese people, they're much more comfortable talking about what's going on in their hearts and minds, much more open, much freer of the conservative traditional elements of Portuguese society, whether that's
Hmm.
the idea of sin in Catholicism or what your parents want you to do. And so I think young people in general are much freer and open. I'd still like to see more openness and more evolution, but we'll see what the coming years bring us.
Yeah, we'll be waiting for that anxiously to see if we can evolve in that sense at least. So going back a little bit to your relationship with Portugal, Portugal was determinant in the way you started to publish your books because the Last Kabbalist of Lisbon, it was published in Portugal first
That's
after
right.
various refusals from American publishers. So at the time, how did you feel about that? Because it must have been very hard to be refused in your own country, in your motherland, and then coming to Portugal and having the opportunity to finally do that.
Yes, it was a strange and very depressing time for me. I took 1 year to research the Last Kabbalist of Lisbon because it takes place in Lisbon in the early 16th century. And I needed to know about daily life. I needed to know about clothing and food and how people built their houses and were the streets paved. There's all these questions about daily life. And it took me a long time to research that because there was no one book then about daily life in Portugal in the 16th century. So I had to read literally dozens
Hmm.
of books and take notes. And then it took me 2 years to write the book. So that was 3 years of my
Hmm.
life. And then another 2 years, 24 American publishers turned the book down. And they all basically said, this is a really thrilling novel based on a true story, the Lisbon Massacre of 1506, in which 2,000 converted Jews were murdered and burnt in the main square, the Rocio.
Hmm.
They all said this is a great book, but it won't sell because, as we know, Americans have a geographical problem. Most Americans think the world begins in Maine and Florida and ends in California and Hawaii. So
Yeah,
Lisbon in 1506 was off their radar. It's not a problem for readers, curiously enough. It's a problem for literary editors who are much
exactly.
more
Hmm.
closed minded because they want to make big profits. Um, and so I had a crazy idea, which is proof that crazy ideas can save us, which was to show the manuscript written in English to a Portuguese publisher. To make a
Hmm.
long story short, I showed it to the first publisher on two different lists that were given to me by friends of publishers. And she loved the book. She had it translated, and it came out in April of 1996. And she warned me that the book might not sell any copies because I was writing about an event that Portuguese people would prefer not to know about. This was a crime against humanity, a pogrom, a riot in which 2,000 forcibly converted Jews were murdered and burnt in the main square that's still at the center of Lisbon. So she said, "Look, you might not sell any copies." But exactly the opposite happened. I think a lot of people were curious about Portuguese history in in Portuguese Jewish history, which
Yeah.
was another taboo topic. During the dictatorship, that was not something you were supposed to talk about. And um, and so this curiosity helped the book sell, and it became number one on the bestseller list 2 weeks after it was out, and which was amazing and strange because it had been turned down by 24 American publishers, and now it was number one in Portugal. So it was wonderful and bizarre at the same time. And then that was how we were able to sell the rights in other countries because they saw the book was a success in Portugal. So we were able to sell rights in Italy and Germany and Brazil and a bit later in the United States and Great Britain. And so that was the start of my career.
So, do you believe you wouldn't have a career if it wasn't for this Portuguese publisher?
That's a really good question. It's hard to know, to evaluate our own past and the directions our past has taken and where we'd be if we turned left instead of right or met a different
Exactly.
person. I think I'd still have a career because I wanted to be a writer and I was very determined to write good books. But I think my career would be different because maybe seeing that nobody was interested in the Last Kabbalist Lisbon, I'd probably have decided to write different sorts of books. Maybe I'd write a book set in the United States or a modern contemporary sort of novel instead of a historical novel. So I think my career would probably I'd probably still be a writer, but I might have a instead of the books I have, I'd have different ones.
Mhm. There's a really funny story related to the Last Kabbalist of Lisbon that I heard you talk about, which was when you met Marianne Faithful, who
Oh yeah.
really liked your book. How was it?
Oh, that was amazing because, I'm a child of the 60s, so I grew up on the Rolling Stones and Marianne
Yeah.
Faithfull singing As Tears Go By. And so I just by accident, I read in a French news magazine an interview with her where she said, they asked her what she was reading, and she said, oh, she's reading The Last Cabals to Lisbon and was loving it. But I thought, oh my God, this is amazing. So I happened to be in Ireland for a book festival, and I had an Irish friend who was a well-known writer there, Dermot Healy, a great writer. And Ireland's a small country like Portugal, so everybody
Yeah.
knows each other. And so I asked Dermot, I said, can you get me Marianne's address or phone number or something? And he made a few phone calls and got me her address. So I left a note in her mailbox saying, here I am, the author of Last Kabbalist of Lisbon. I'm in Ireland because she was living in Dublin then. Can
And
we get together?
that was very bold of you just to go there and put a
Well,
note in the mailbox.
Well, she said she loved my book, so I figured the worst that can happen is she won't contact me, and that's fine.
Sure.
We don't
Yeah.
expect famous people to always contact us. So I left a note, and then a couple of days later, I was at Dermot's house in Sligo, and the phone rings, and he answers it, and he says, "It's Marianne Faithful for you," which was,
Wow.
amazing. It's like someone saying it's Mick Jagger for you.
Yeah.
And so we had a really nice time. We spent the afternoon with Marianne and her manager and had a lovely time. And she's a very bright, a bit odd, but very bright, wonderful person. And I'm a big fan of her singing.
Yeah, yeah, I know you love music as well, and you have studied a bit of music too. And you were, like you said, a Rolling Stones fan and a Beatles fan,
Yeah.
and you have lived in that time. It must have been really interesting to experience that in the first person.
Well, I think I got really lucky. I occasionally post on Facebook about concerts I saw, like Simon and Garfunkel
Wow.
in in New York in 1967. And the first group, the opening act was the Doors. Imagine that, the Doors opening for Simon
Wow.
and Garfunkel. And so, people, all sorts of young people write to me and say, I'm so envious you got to see the Doors.
Yeah.
And so I saw George Harrison twice and Paul McCartney, and I've seen the Rolling Stones and Simon and Garfunkel at least three times, and Leonard Cohen and Judy Collins in North Carolina
Mhm.
and Joni Mitchell, Crosby, Stills and Nash. So I feel
Wow.
really lucky that I've had a chance to see people who've changed the world. Um, because I consider the Beatles some of the most important people of the 20th century, that they changed so much.
They did.
And
Is it true that the first record you bought was from the Beatles
yeah,
at
Meet the
the age of
Beatles.
8 or something?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Meet the Beatles, 1964. I Want to Hold Your Hand, and some other big hits like that. Love Me Do, I think, was on it. Anyway, yeah, I've been listening to rock and roll since I was 8 years old, which maybe explains why I'm a bit odd myself.
And that's just one of the moments in history where you were present, because when you were a very young age, I know that you've been in protests against the Vietnam War with your father. How did that impact you growing up?
Well, both my parents were very politically minded. They didn't always participate in events because we were living in the suburbs and it wasn't always, easy to get to Manhattan or so, but they were very political. My father often discussed politics. He was very left wing. Um, growing up Jewish in America in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, there was a lot of anti Semitism, a lot of people who didn't like Jews being in the United States. So, that made them very political at a very young age. And then I had an older brother who was at university in the 1960s. Obviously, that was a time of protest against the Vietnam War. And so at a very young age, I was always thinking about, you know, uh, Native American rights and civil rights movement with the African Americans, Martin Luther King, and later gay rights, feminism. I've always been, I wouldn't say I've been very involved in it. I'm not a very overtly political person, but I do express my opinions. And I was involved in some minor way, for instance, in the gay rights movement in San Francisco.
I was going
So,
to ask about that. Were you
yeah,
in San Francisco when Harvey Milk was advocating for gay rights?
that's right. Harvey was the first elected official in the United States who was openly gay. So it was very
Exactly.
important. Harvey was very charismatic, funny, nice person, not at all formal or standoffish. He was very friendly. I knew him when he still had a camera shop in the Castro, which was one of the gay neighborhoods in San Francisco. So we would go to the camera shop when we needed
Hmm.
film, and
Yeah.
we'd see his lover Scott, and sometimes Harvey was there in his suit because he was working in City Hall back then. And
Yeah.
so sometimes we would joke around and talk, and yeah, I mean, Harvey was an important person for
Indeed.
everybody
Yeah,
in the
indeed.
gay movement. And I always remember him saying to me, when your postman comes out and he's gay, and when your kid's favorite teacher at school comes out and we know she's a lesbian, when we're surrounded by people who come out of the closet and we realize they're great people and normal people and just like us, then the prejudice and the hatred will end. And so I always think about that when I talk about my own sexuality, in the hopes that young kids will be able to live freer and more happier and more genuine lives, and that the prejudice will end.
Exactly. So San Francisco must have a special meaning for you. That's where you moved after a while living in New York. And you met Elchand, your husband, there as well in the year I was born,
Ah,
curiously. Yeah.
wonderful.
Yeah. And then I know that you took some time to travel, maybe in the years before, right? So how important is traveling to you? You got to meet Europe and anywhere
Yeah.
else?
Well, Europe was extremely important to me, because no one in my family had ever traveled.
Mm. But
My parents were
you were descendant from Europeans, right? Your
right.
grandparents were from Poland. Yeah.
Exactly. All four of my grandparents immigrated to the United States around 1905, and my parents were born in New York. But my parents never traveled, for various reasons, and so I grew up hoping that one day, I'd be able to go to Europe or Australia or South America, and I did. So the first
Mhm.
trip I took was to Europe. I stayed 4.5 months. I was one of those American kids back in the
Backpacking.
1970s with a backpack,
Yeah.
and sleeping out on the street on occasion when I couldn't afford a hotel. And I had a wonderful time. The first part of it was a music program because I was studying classical guitar back then. So I studied music and gave small concerts with other kids in Europe, in Italy, for the first 6 to 7 weeks. And then I traveled with a friend for another, 7, 8 weeks. And I loved it. It changed my life because one moment I'm in New York, Kennedy Airport, flying to Italy, and the next moment I'm in Assisi, one of the most beautiful towns in the world, staying in the house of an Italian family in a small cot. And the streets are ancient cobblestones. The churches, there was no mass tourism back then, so we could go to the Church of San Francisco and all the other places of worship in Assisi anytime we wanted. I could see the frescoes by Giotto anytime I wanted. And suddenly it was like I was in a medieval city, and I thought, wow, I don't have to live my whole life in America. I can do whatever I want. And I think traveling can give us that amazing sense of freedom and that amazing sense that what we thought our lives were isn't what our lives can be. Our lives can be much bigger and broader, and we begin to doubt our own assumptions about the way people should think and behave, because Italians, like Portuguese people, think very differently from Americans about all sorts of important topics. And so
Exactly.
suddenly I
Hmm.
realized, my life can change.
Hmm. And at that time, did you visit Portugal, or is it was just
No,
later? Later.
No, I only came to Portugal for the first time in 1980, after I met Alex, who was from Mozambique, and who was a professor at the University of California in Berkeley. And when we
Hmm.
fell in love and started living together, he would come to do summer school teaching in Porto for 2 to 3 weeks every summer. And so I started coming with him, and that's how I first knew Porto. And then
Hmm.
we would visit Lisbon because my father-in-law, his dad, was living in Lisbon at the time. So I got to know a little bit about the country and travel around.
Hmm. So Alshant was teaching, but you also teached in Porto. Do you miss that part of your life, being a teacher?
Yes and no. I taught for 16 years journalism, different aspects of journalism, and I loved it. It was great having contact with bright kids, and you know, teaching was important for me because I learned how to speak in front of other people and stop being so nervous, and to prepare well and to do a good job. And it relaxed me in terms of doing what we're doing now, talking over
Hmm.
over the internet. I
Yeah.
stopped being so nervous about it and realized I could do a good job if I prepared. And so it was part of my growth learning how to teach. And I I miss the contact with kids, but I don't miss, the 3 days a week of marking papers and turning in grades and the
Yeah.
bureaucracy. And I'm really very, very happy and lucky and fortunate to be able to make a living writing my novels.
Yeah. And I've met one of your students recently, and I know that the feedback from your students was really good. They really loved you as a teacher, so they must miss you.
Well, they're very kind. At the first years were very hard because I had to teach in Portuguese and I didn't know Portuguese. So I did a mixture of English and Portuguese, and my first classes weren't so good. They were kind of
Mhm.
mediocre because unless you can speak a language fluently, it's very hard to communicate subtle ideas and complexities. So that took a while for me to be able to do. But you know what? The students always tell me that you were so different. You were such a breath of fresh air for us because you weren't like any of our other teachers. So I think to some extent I had that effect on them, that I brought another culture into their lives, which is always useful.
Exactly. And about your new projects, I know you're working on a new book in Portuguese. The story will be in the 17th century. Is that
Right.
right? Yeah. So what are you doing right now? Are you still taking a long time, or will it be
Yeah, I
completed
mean,
this year?
I didn't do this consciously, but the book is going to be enormous. It wasn't my plan. My plan was to write, 300, 350 pages, 400 pages, but I think it's going to be like 1,000 pages. So I'm going to have to divide it into 2 volumes, I think, because otherwise it's just too long. And it takes place in the 17th century. It starts in a beautiful Portuguese village called Castelo Rodrigo, which I would recommend to everyone. Old granite houses. It's hardly changed since the 16th, 17th century. It's on top of a small mountain or large hill. So it looks a bit like those Italian hill towns in Umbria or in Tuscany. And it's about the Inquisition, this religious dictatorship that was in Portugal from 1536 until around 1820, that
Hmm.
persecuted anyone with different ideas and persecuted converted Jews who were still practicing their religion, and persecuted anyone who had a free mind, basically, or curiosity about the world, and put them in prisons and tortured them. And anyway, so it's about the effect of the Inquisition on this small village, and in particular on my narrator, who starts the book as a young boy and who doesn't understand, for instance, why his best friend suddenly disappears. His best friend Lena and her parents just disappear, and no one will explain it to him because no one wants to explain about this religious dictatorship. They don't want children to understand what's going on and that the secret Jews are being persecuted. And so he grows up mystified by what's happening in his village and angry. And it's about what happens to him and his family. And I'm nearing the end now. I think I've probably got another couple months of writing to do, and then I have to go
Okay.
back to the beginning and rewrite everything because
Oh.
when you do I never write a first draft. This is like a sixth or seventh draft because I'm constantly rewriting. But I need to go back to the beginning and check all the writing all the way through. So I'm not anywhere close to finishing it, but at least I'm close to finishing a sixth or seventh draft or something like
Yeah, okay, so it's nice to know that we'll have new work from Richard Zimler coming soon, or soon as is possible,
that. As soon as I can finish it.
soon as you can. So this is another book where you had to study a lot and prepare a lot and read a lot of documents and all that.
Absolutely.
Do you think that the work of an author is a little bit like the work of an actor, for instance?
I do, because I generally write in the first person. So in this case, my narrator, his name is Isaac, and he's a secret Jew living in this small village, Castelo Rodrigo, and grows up with his dad and mom and his brother, small younger brother and sister. And so I have to sort of enter into him. I become
Hmm.
Isaac, and I see the world from his point of view. And he has this wonderful best friend, Lena, and he goes up to her roof with her dad, and her dad teaches him the constellations and teaches him a little bit about Greek mythology because the constellations have to do with Greek mythology, of course.
Hmm.
And he has this second family with them, and suddenly, from one day to the next, they disappear. And so I experienced that from Isaac's point of view, the anger that no one will tell him where they are, the worry, what's happening to Lena? Is she okay? Will she survive? And in the years to come, as he grows up, what happened to her? Will I ever see
Hmm.
her again? Will I
Yeah.
ever see her mom and dad again? And if people can just disappear from one day to the next, what can we count on? It's kind of an
Exactly. Hmm.
existential philosophical question. What can we count on during a religious dictatorship?
So you feel that in the first person.
Absolutely.
Are you one of those authors that when you start writing a book, you already know how it's going to finish, or it depends on how the story goes during the way?
I have no idea. I usually know what's going to happen in the first chapter, but after that, I discover what the book wants to be. It's almost like it is like I'm discovering what the story would like me to tell. I know that sounds strange, but that's the
Mm.
only way I can do it because the first chapter determines the second chapter. The second determines the third, and so on. So until I write the fourth chapter, how can I possibly know what's going to happen in the fifth chapter? It's impossible. And then as you're writing, you test different alternatives. And some of the alternatives seem very forced, usually because you're making a character do something that he or she wouldn't do. And so you have to test different alternatives and you pick the one that seems best to you, that seems the most moving or the most troubling or the most, you know, most depressing or shocking. And then you go from there. And so, no, and I have no idea what the ending is going to be. I'm now that I'm nearing the ending, I kind of can glimpse it, but
Mhm.
I'm still not sure of what the last chapter is going to be. I'll find out when I get there.
Oh, that's really interesting. Do you still write your books for adults in English and then translate it to Portuguese?
Yeah, although I
Mhm.
speak Portuguese fluently,
You do.
uh, I can't write a novel in English. No, writing a novel is too difficult, too demanding. It forced the author has to be able to evaluate all the different nuances. If
Hmm.
I choose a verb and it's too strong, I need to know that and choose a slightly weaker verb. Um, and the rhythm of the sentences needs to be right to my ear. The ear is extremely important for a writer. You have to develop this poetic ear to understand the
Hmm.
rhythm of a language, the sound of words. And I don't have that in Portuguese as well developed as I have that in English.
Hmm.
I write children's books in Portuguese
I
because
was going
they're,
to I was going to ask you about
yeah,
that because I know you're working on a new book for children, right?
exactly.
Yeah.
And there, of course, my language skills are almost good enough to do it. I do need someone or more than one person to read it and proofread it and make sure, because although I usually write Portuguese correctly in terms of grammar, I will occasionally say something in a very awkward way. It's grammatically correct,
Mhm. Yeah.
but no Portuguese person would write it that way.
Yeah.
And so I need Alex and then my editor at Porto Editora to go over the story and check everything and make changes. And that's
Mhm.
normal. I mean, even if you're a Portuguese writer, you need an editor to go over all your sentences and make sure they're okay and understandable. That's perfectly normal.
Mhm. When can we expect that children's book?
But that children's book is coming along pretty good. I should be finished with it in the next couple of weeks. Then I'll give it to my publisher, and then we need illustrations, and
Okay.
that can take a while. So I'm thinking that the best thing for me would be to publish it probably in March or April of next year, because it takes a while to prepare the book, especially
Sure.
with illustrations and print
Hmm.
it. Um, and I'd love to have it out by the next book fair. We have a book
Hmm.
fair coming up in Lisbon, which
Yeah.
is a big event here in
Hmm.
September, but usually it starts at the end of May. So maybe next year we'll start it at the end of May, in which case it would be great to have a new children's book to sell.
Okay, we'll wait for that anxiously as
I
well.
hope so.
Do you feel a different person when you're speaking Portuguese and when you're speaking English? Because I know it's
Yeah,
hard
I
to
do.
separate the two of them. Yeah.
Yeah, you probably do too. I think
So
we all
in
do.
some in some ways, yes, yes.
Yeah, no matter how fluent we are, unless we're completely and amazingly bilingual, which almost nobody is, we have slightly different ways of approaching language and ourselves. We have a slightly different identity in a different language. In Portuguese, just to give you an example, in English, I can imitate people's voices and accents quite well, and I often play around with that. And I can be, sarcastic and ironic very easily, a kind of New York sense of humor. But in Portuguese, it's harder for me to do that. So my sense of humor in Portuguese is different. And I also, since the culture here is different and people react differently to humor, I have to be more careful in Portuguese as well,
Hmm.
because, I may need to apologize and say, I was just trying to be funny. I didn't mean to offend you. Whereas in English, I'm better able to, to gauge what I can say and what I can't say. So,
Hmm.
yeah, my personality is different. And that's okay. You get used to that when you're living in a foreign country. You stop being. I think some people still get frustrated with that. I tend not to worry about it anymore. I am who I am in whatever language I'm talking.
Exactly. After 30 years in Portugal, was it hard for you to relate with your mother country, your motherland, while it was being led by people that you didn't trust, like Trump, for instance,
Yeah.
at that time?
Yes, it was very hard. There were times, I have to say, when I felt like I didn't know America anymore, and that maybe I had lived an illusion while growing up there, thinking America was one thing and discovering it was something else. Um, One of my most down moments and disorienting moments came during the recent election. The first results in many states like Pennsylvania and Georgia that would later go to Biden showed that Trump was winning at the beginning, and that he might even win the election. And I grew very upset and depressed. And I thought, I just don't understand America. I don't know this country. I can't relate to these people who vote for him, who vote for a sociopath who's ignorant and racist and repulsive. I just don't understand it. And so, yes, there have been many times over the past 4 years that I thought, I'm an American, and I
Hmm.
love certain parts of America. I love the national parks, and I love, parts of New York, and San
Sure.
Francisco was wonderful to me. But maybe that period of America being a wonderful, interesting place is over. And I think that may be true. I mean, I think the next
Hmm.
decades are going to belong to other countries, and that
But what do you
and that
think that?
Trump's election was in part a symptom of the fact that the age of the American empire is over. It's over, and people don't want to get used to that. They want to fight against that. They want to elect someone who says America's still great and number one, and we're going to rule the
Mhm.
world. And it's going to take Americans a while to get used to the idea that maybe they won't run the world in the rest of the 21st century.
So you think Biden is just the beginning of the change? It will continue
Well,
changing with someone else in office?
I hope so. I mean, I hope we
Mhm.
can change course with Biden and move toward a more compassionate, understanding, empathetic country, a country with a better healthcare system for everyone. I think COVID-19 has proven that we all in this world need a healthcare system that will provide good medications and vaccines to everyone. Because if certain poorer countries don't have healthcare systems, then the virus is going to get out of control, and they're going to develop variants that threaten everyone. So a bad healthcare system, an inadequate healthcare system in India, Brazil, and parts of Africa is a threat to all of us, and not just for ethical reasons, but even for just logistical reasons. We need to reduce the gap between the rich and the poor all over the world and make this world a more equal place for everyone. If not,
Mhm.
COVID-19 is just the start. There's going to be other pandemics.
Oh, let's just hope they take some time to get there because we're still
I
trying
hope so.
to recover from the first pandemic, and even now in the Lisbon area and Portugal in general, we're going back to those numbers that are
I
very
know.
worrying. So we're all doing the best we can, we hope. So coming back to your relationship with Portugal, I know you did a great effort to participate, to adapt, to learn the language, and you did it very well. So you must be really proud, even 4 years ago when you got the Medal of Honor for the city of
Hmm.
Porto. Hmm.
I am proud. I mean, pride is an interesting emotion. I hear people say all the time, I'm proud to be an American, I'm proud to be Portuguese. And I don't quite understand that. I was born in America, I had no choice. For
Hmm.
me, pride is something else. Pride is something that you work for, that you struggle for, that you suffer to achieve. And once you've been able to get part of the way there or all the way there, then you feel pride because it's an accomplishment. So I'm proud of my
Exactly.
novels because they took an
Hmm.
enormous amount of work and it was very difficult for me to be published, and I managed to keep my sanity. So I'm proud of that. I'm proud of learning to speak Portuguese because that was extremely difficult for me, and there were many moments when I felt like giving up. And I'm proud that I've adapted to this country pretty well because there were times when I had no friends and I was very isolated and I didn't know if I'd be able to survive here. And so, yes, I love that. I'm happy to be here, and and I'm proud of Alex because things weren't easy for him too. Moving to Portugal, he grew up in Mozambique, so that was a foreign country too. So I'm
Exactly.
very proud of him being able to, you know, do his science and create a new center for scientific research. And eventually, now he's part of Parliament. He's a deputy in Parliament, an MP. So, we're both very lucky. We've led lives, the lives that we wanted to have, and there's not anything better than that.
You have a very beautiful history, the both of you,
Thank
and I
you.
congratulate you for that. You've been together just for as many years that I am been alive, for 42 years, since you met the year I was born, like I was saying
Yeah.
a bit ago, and that's a really beautiful story.
Thank you.
So congratulations. I hope that in the future we can count on your work and your books and your new publishings for children and for adults as well, rather sooner than later,
Hope
even when
so.
with all this going on. And thank you so much for your time. It's been a real pleasure talking to you here in More Than Words.
Thank you for having me. I'm very grateful to be able to share my experiences with your spectators and viewers and listeners. And thanks so much for the invitation and for doing the interview with me.
Thank you. See you next time. Bye bye.
See you next time.
Thank you.